So, bonjour, mesdames, messieurs. Today is a special Bastille Day version of Update on transport in the time of COVID. There they are storming the Bastille, and they had it pretty easy compared to what we have to deal with nowadays. But anyway, it's the same old story this week. Delays, non-delays, some stuff, some not stuff, some bad stuff, some backlash, etc. Anyway, I'm Robert Davis. I'm chair of the Road Danger Reduction Forum. If you want to have any specific links, slides, or information, email me on that address, chair@rdrf@aol.com. Okay, so try and keep it nice and snappy. As it's Bastille Day, I should have had some of those wonderful videos of what's happening in Paris at the moment, but I assume you've all seen them. Okay, so general news from last week. I talked about how there was activation of the Traffic Management Act 2004 Part 6. The minister in the House of Commons said, yes, he was going to activate it. However, I think it was David Cox said there was a written answer where it was the opposite was said. The commencement of Part 6 of the Traffic Management Act 2004 is a long-standing and complex issue, which we are looking at carefully, including the role that moving traffic enforcement powers could play in helping councils to deliver their transport recovery plans. No decisions have yet been taken. So yes, delay. Delays in the updated National Cycling and Walking Plan that was due for June. We're now halfway through July. The inspectorate was supposed to happen. The Active Travel Commissioner in charge of it was supposed to happen. Neither of those have happened. The LTN 208 update, which some people listening have played a part in doing, is no sign of that just yet. The voucher scheme was due to start by the end of June. It is open for repairers, but not yet customers. So all big delay. Then we have the invitations for the second tranche of the emergency active travel funding, and that has finally gone out. Okay, so let's look at that. We have a copy of a letter sent by Mr. Furness on July the 10th. I don't know if it's supposed to be in the public realm or not. It obviously has gone to all local authorities in England, this time outside London. Okay, so this is for all of England outside London. And you can have a look at the letter, which don't tell anybody where you got it from. It's there on that link. And here are some things about it. The first tranche was for £45 million. This is the biggie for 180. So this is the real big heavy stuff coming in. And the submission deadline for your local authority, if you're outside London in England, is Friday the 7th of August. It has to be out to the Department for Transport by that time. Now, here's an extract, two extracts from it. As with tranche 1, to receive any funding, authorities will need to satisfy the department that they have swift and meaningful plans to reallocate road space to cyclists and pedestrians. And they say here, which I think was not in the original letter for the first tranche, both groups rather than one or the other, including on strategic corridors. Schemes that do not meaningfully alter the status quo on the road will not be funded. That same important sentence. And again, all cycling schemes, permanent or temporary, will need to include segregation or point closures to through traffic. Advisory cycle lanes and those marked only with white paint will not be funded. So it's the same kind of heavy language. Funding in the second tranche will also depend on how swiftly and effectively authorities have implemented the plans for which they have received funding in the first tranche. So, you know, forceful wording again, but the times seem to be slipping, because the way I look at it is that if stuff goes in by Friday the 7th of August, people will be notified of results, say, by about the end of August or before the end of August. One hopes that it isn't the normal dead period that it is in local and central government. And will stuff be able to go in before schools go back? Well, not really. Now it's all slipping back behind that date. Okay, that's my take on it. I'd like to hear what other people have to say about it. Okay, now there's an important 2 or 3 important reports. New research by Transport for Quality of Life shows that the government's flagship road investment strategy of £27 billion over 5 years threatens the UK's commitment on climate change. The report shows that roads programme will add 20 million tonnes of carbon dioxide to UK emissions from the strategic road network between now and 2032, whereas those emissions need to be cut by 167 million tonnes to meet climate targets. And Lynn Sloman, who was one of the co-authors, who's actually, I would say, in the past, she's been pretty polite and quiet and nice. This is an institutional problem. There are people in the Department for Transport and Highways England who have built their careers on big road building budgets, and they won't easily give them up. Now, there's the report. Do download it and have a quick look through it. The carbon impact of the National Roads Programme. When it came out, there was a response from the Department for Transport almost immediately saying, oh, it's all wrong, we rebut it. Quite how you rebut something without going through it and giving a response to the fairly detailed analyses, well, and this is what Professor Annable said, who's one of the co-authors, said, or one of the contributors. The DFT's rebuttal of this extremely important, meticulously researched and transparent report, with no attempt to explain their assessment of it, is akin to a Trumpian claim of fake news. Department for Transport, we look forward to seeing your fact check of it. And, you know, she's a professor, and this is important. And what's equally important is the way the Department for Transport have simply kind of ignored it. One short article, it's by Damien Carrington in The Guardian. He's actually been quite good, quite particular about looking at issues about pollution. And the latest report shows compelling evidence of a positive relationship between air pollution and particularly fine particle concentrations on the one hand, and COVID-19 cases, hospital admissions and deaths on the other. This relationship persists even after controlling for a wide range of explanatory factors. So another argument for having better air quality, more active travel, less motor vehicles, etc. Also, please, remember this consultation, it's just come out. You don't have to do it this week, but don't forget about it. Okay, I repeat, this logo, which was used originally in Edinburgh, end of enough. Okay, now here's a little story. The Reigate town centre cycle lane story, which you may have read about. Cycle Reigate, and this Twitter account had a very good thread on this, which they call, was it set up to fail? Because basically an advisory cycle lane pop-up went in Reigate town centre and was taken out very soon afterwards. So they say, first of all, it was too little, it was isolated, it wasn't linked into any cycle routes, it was put in too late, car use had started back up by the time it went in. There was no proper community engagement. There were no other community benefits other than some help for some cyclists in one place. They stonked in parking for 50 bikes all in one place, So it's kind of designed to look empty. Signing makes it look like the cycle lane is responsible for delays, which were exaggerated. And of course, inadequate ambition meant only 50% funding, with taxpayers thinking they have to pay the extra to make up the difference. I still don't know what happens when councils, local authorities have had less than 100%, what happens? Do they only get half the funding for half the schemes, or do they have to put in all the schemes and pay for half of it themselves? I'm a bit confused. I would like clarification. And that's another thread which explains what happened. That's the Reigate story. Okay, some stuff in UK on the ground. This is from Sheffield, and I've got a screenshot from it. Looks like what used to be a sort of normal advisory cycle lane has opened up quite a lot. Apparently this is because it was on the inner relief road, which had had additional space added to it. But do go on to that thread to see the actual video. A lot of videos are coming out now, and this one kind of looked pretty reasonable to me. Okay, back to something bad. This is a video from BBC Yorkshire, and it says, this footage shows the moment an ambulance's path was blocked by a new cycle lane in Sheffield. Paramedics had to leave the vehicle to move the bollards, actually the barriers, out of the way. So a lot of us piled in on this because it wasn't actually the cycle lane causing the blockage, it was the cars there. And if the ambulance hadn't been able to get into the advisory cycle lane, it would have been stopped for even longer. So a case of bias. Please, you know, do the pile-ins here. Carlton Reed's talked about how good quality cycle lanes can be very good for emergency vehicles. Leicester, here's some stuff going in. This is from Brownstone Lane East. I thought I'd kind of stick that up because to me that looks like the old advisories having cylinders on them, which is fine. But, you know, what do you think about the general layout of that highway? It's a sort of fairly classic big central hatching, and then you get refuges every now and again. Maybe there are ways it could be done differently with less median marking and islands and whatnot. Maybe moving these lanes to make them a bit wider. I don't know, Leicester. It's just my feeling that the lanes do tend to be a bit narrow. My personal observation. 4 minutes before we went on air, I got this from the Leavenshume B network. Said, can you put this on today's ideas with beers? Giving me precisely 4 minutes. Please don't try and do this as a general rule, people. I did actually look at it here, though, and it says that they accept that Manchester City Council is not going to be involved with part of its project. I really don't know what this is all about. Someone from Manchester will have to explain, but that they just asked me to put that up, so I did. Colchester, another bit of backlash. Footway extensions on North Station Road were seen to be an eyesore and parking spaces were lost. So big complaints, and the leader of the council got involved, and so they've been taken away. Right, now London. Here's just a bit of survey stuff from the Evening Standard. They reckon 50,000 jobs in hospitality, etc., due to disappear. 88% say they're not comfortable being on public transport. Underground's only been carrying 20% of usual daily passengers. Buses about 37%. 57% of Londoners say they have been working from home in lockdown. That's an important figure, I think. And the second most important figure is that 1 million fewer commuters than usual are crossing into central London to work each day. So we're still in that kind of low traffic period, although of course summer holidays may be kicking in now. Right, something else. Big cuts in TfL budgets. These have been forensically examined by Last Not Lost. He really comes up with all the bits and pieces of information that other people miss. Do look at his thread. It's really what Caroline Russell was talking about, who I mentioned talking about a couple of weeks ago, about how all the streetscape stuff is great, but the healthy streets program has obviously been cut back massively because of a lack of funding for TfL. And here's a bit of a table from the people at Cycle Hoop who do the hangars, which are the officially approved on-street cycle parking in London, funded by TfL. They put together a table for me, and you can see that there are 9,500 bikes in them at the moment, about another 600 people waiting to get in, and there's a waiting list of over 34,000. And I would say, bearing in mind half the dwellings in London are flats, most of them are not on the first floor, a lot of houses are quite small. There is a desperate need for good quality, secure and convenient cycle parking. And this is really, you know, as you can see from that 34,000 waiting list, this is really scratching the surface. Okay, London, here we go. The final round of allocations to boroughs, now up to £33 million, has been made, and Laura Laker has dug that out. Here's the link. And it is supposedly to be, the schemes are supposedly to be done before the return of schools in September. Now, I've got a quote here from Simon Monk. I don't know if Simon's here today. He said the big total winners are either very much the usual suspects and or already had schemes in motion, except for Haringey, Ealing and Wandsworth, which all received over £1 million, and Sutton, which was awarded just under £1 million. Redbridge, Harrow and Brent were pleasant surprises, as these are not boroughs with a proven track record on delivery of cycle schemes. You can say that again. His comment is, that's a lot of boroughs who don't have a lot of track record on delivery in outer London, with a lot of schemes to get through now fast. So, you know, it's, the money's there and they've got to crack on, and they've got about 6 weeks to do it in, and they should, but some of them really don't have a record of doing it. So what happens? What happens if money is allocated, it isn't spent, it goes on the wrong stuff? Who's checking up? Do shortfalls have to be made out of the council's own internal budgets, or what happens? What's Transport for London going to do? Is it going to wave a big stick? Is it going to do anything? We don't know. In the past, it could threaten to reduce local implementation plan funding, but that's suspended at the moment. So this is from the £5 million of the first tranche of London funding. There's another £25 million to come. So still more funding to come in another tranche. Also, there are TfL's own schemes. That's Simon Monk was very keen to point out to me that there is more to come from TfL on its own schemes. And here you can see one which a lot has been talked about, is Euston Road. There are the cylinders or wands on Euston Road going eastbound. It's supposed to be all sorted out by the end of August, you know, with a similar lane on the other side. One must hope so. So incidentally, I have had reports of wands and cylinders being knocked down, and you know, it would be nice if that didn't happen. But another point, the Healthy Streets scorecard, which was produced before the COVID emergency, showed a lack of progress in London. So go to that link and you can see what that's about. Okay, here's certain bits and pieces in London boroughs. There's London Borough of, I beg your pardon, Royal Borough of Kingston upon Thames. Very good Twitter thread here showing what's happening in Kingston. Here's a nice big cycle lane in Malden Road, Kingston. There's the city. 1900 cycle parking spaces will be installed in the place of car parking bays. City is looking very nice. Nice photo by Carlton Reid. Royal Parks are trialling reduction of through traffic in some parks, but not Regent's Park where it's really needed. In Richmond Park, cars are now being allowed into the car parks, but not beyond, and still haven't got cycling at weekends. Southwark, 5 out of 7 new modal filters have been introduced in the Walworth low traffic neighborhood here. Merton is going to get 28 school streets. Redbridge has a program called Quiet Streets in Redbridge. You know, we remember we were talking about whether you should say low traffic neighborhoods, LTNs, whatever. They call it Quiet Streets in Redbridge, which seems to be a nice phrase. And the councillor said the first neighbourhoods we'll be working with are these ones. I do have to say about the low traffic neighbourhoods, what does seem to have happened is that some officers have done little maps and said, right, we will investigate if this is going to be a low traffic neighbourhood. They haven't actually started the community engagement, whereas, you know, people like Lambeth and Hackney have already done that. They've already done the community engagement. They've already done all the involvement with the community, and they're in. So a bit of delay there. Hackney, oh yes, there's an example of a filter, nice bit of filtering in Hackney, and some signing done by Simon Still. And you can see that's been done properly. That, notice the little leg up there, that shows that's a proper scooter, not one of the dreaded e-scooter spawn of Satan, a proper one. Okay, now on to some various campaigns. Still remember the Transport Action Network trying to stop the road building campaign. Cycling UK has got a new thing on how to push for cycling and walking infrastructure. Don't forget Phil Goodwin's article. I keep on banging on about it. It's really necessary. Transport for New Homes report. The Oxfordshire Livable Streets video. Apparently they're coming up with a lot of good video stuff. Oxfordshire Livable Streets. Alex is doing videos for Cycling Embassy of Great Britain. A report by Campaign for Better Transport, used to be Transport 2000, on renewing the transport system. That's new. Nice video from the BBC, webinars from Cycling UK, Welsh Letter doing traffic orders. Yeah, here's the London Healthy Streets scorecard. Take a look at that. That's new. That's old. That's old. That's old, but keep the link. Strands, yeah. And this is a new Cycling UK thing on how my council can get cash. Oh no, sorry, that's the old one. The other one was the new one. And don't forget that consultation on roads policing. Okay, a couple more things. Agilysis did an analysis of the biggest issues on our country roads in COVID, and you can, as it should come as no surprise, the reduction in flow increased the proportion of vehicles more than 50 miles an hour by 12% on 30-mile-an-hour roads, and on 60-mile-an-hour roads by 725%. So yes, the ultra speeding, which we've talked about. Back to London Borough of Lambeth, as we said last week, the markings done with community engagement may be non-compliant, but they are not illegal. Okay, that's it for today.
Brilliant, thanks, Bob.
Brian, you working?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're fine. You're good.
Ah, yeah. Nice. I mean, there's no point in being alive for me unless everybody can hear my voice all the time. So I was in an existential crisis then. But yeah, big thanks to Bob. I know there's a few people who want to come in with a couple of points of order. So I'm going to invite Claire Stocks to come in and tell us about somewhere in South Manchester, maybe. Claire, are you there?
Hi, yeah, and sorry I wasn't here for the first 10 minutes or so. I was just gonna, I think this has been being talked about in the chat, but probably happened too late for Rob's update. It's just that there's a part of Manchester called Levenshume, which had bid to the B Network fund pot for money. They got £2.5 million for a filtered neighbourhood, and it was a really ambitious scheme and led by a group in the community. This pace of this was brought forward because of COVID, so they speeded the scheme up, and it was due to kind of start around now. But it all kicked off in the community, and there's been quite a lot of nastiness happening on Facebook, etc. And it will, I think it's going to be mentioned in Grahame's talk, because we're going to be talking about kind of Backlash. You know, last week we talked about opposition to schemes like this, but anyway, it's just been announced this afternoon that actually, and I wanted to share it here because I think it's a really significant and not, you know, bad step, in that the council have basically parted ways with the community group that was set up to effectively be the bridge between the council and the community. So the community group that was formed and was funded as part of the scheme, as a result of this kind of vicious backlash, has actually parted ways with the council. So now it's unclear about whether that scheme is. They'd already announced that the scheme was being delayed to, and I think Grahame is going to talk about this in his presentation about what you do about Backlash. But just, this is really bad news for, you know, we know there's going to be opposition to these schemes, but you kind of hope that councils are going to ride it out. And in this case, I think it's fair to say that the local councillors have not stepped in when they needed to. They were behind it. They should, you know, they signed up to this from day one, and have not really been very visible at all. Neither has the kind of leadership within the council who supported the scheme and backed it for funding. Ultimately, nothing gets B Network funding without the council support. So I'm sort of sharing it in that kind of, it's an example of actually where the knockers have won on this, in this example. So it's really not very good news.
Yeah, just to come back in on that, I mean, yeah, thanks for that, Claire. Obviously, being a bit more inside the house, we have slightly different perspectives and on Manchester, and I'm hoping that they'll take greater ownership, and they've seen that this is a serious element of the programme, that, and it is hot, and maybe they want to take more control. So I'm hoping it's the latter, and they just want to do things properly. And I know they've been seeking advice across the country, and they do genuinely want to make some changes there. But yeah, it is disappointing when a community group gets pulled out, and I know Pauline's done so much work and we all loved her, but I'm hoping that it's still a live project, it's still happening, the money's still there, and it will still get delivered. Manchester want to try a different way, so I'm hoping we can all support them in that. That's my very diplomatic response on that one, but then, you know, that's what get paid to do. Has anybody else got any points of order for Bob and anything before we move on to Grahame? I've heard great things about Grahame's talk, by the way. Everybody's been raving about it in Great Manchester, so one to look forward to. But I can't hear anybody coming in, so that's good.
I was just going to
say, Simon. Yep.
I wanted to ask about whether we know when the funds for tranche 1 actually cleared with the local authorities, i.e. when did the clock start for the 4 and the 8 weeks? Because we're getting a lot of obfuscation about that.
People I know, the money's in the account.
I was going to say, shall I wait on engagement and consultation till later? But I mean, I think the short answer is, if the local councillors won't stand up for this stuff, we're going to see a lot more of this before it, before it ends. And I think we're just going to have to be really quite tough on some of this stuff in terms of, if you don't deliver, why have you got the money? But also, you need to be able to, if a scheme falls over, and many of these schemes will, because these are trials and these are new approaches and councils aren't used to delivering this, they've got to get straight back up and stand up and do, make some changes, get the councillors back on board, show some leadership and push it back out here. Otherwise, everything will be up for grabs. At the end of the day, if a few people being very shouty on Facebook is enough to derail a scheme, and that does derail a scheme, you send a message straight away that your council will just keep derailing schemes left, right and centre every time there's controversy.
The scheme is not derailed.
Can I say something about Madeira Drive quickly? Is that we've had a mass invasion going back to the 60s, that the mods have all come back down. It's been advertised, the LTDA, the London Scooters Association have all come down to enforce their age-old right to ride scooters up and down Madeira Drive. And there was a standoff with the police last weekend and the weekend before. And the police are standing up to them at the moment, but the council is definitely wavering. We've had a petition, 8,000 signatures against, about 4,000 of those were from outside Brighton, and we think we know where they're coming from. So we're getting the London hangovers, as it were, coming down and trying to invade, and similarly on Old Shoreham Road. So I think what Simon is saying is particularly the case, that there is definitely wavering, even in places that want to do things. There's a lot of organised opposition going on, and they're not just doing their own area.
Just to come in there, again on the engagement piece, from our Bourneville, so from Birmingham, where we've got, I think, a really strong feeling that there's a lot of community support for the work the council is doing. And of course, we're looking forward to it coming through shortly and anticipating the pushback, the backlash that everyone's talking about. So some of you will know David Cox pulled together a webinar designed to get some residents behind these ideas across the city, and I thought that went really well. It was good to have Phil Jones there, and perhaps some of the rest of you. I've dropped the video for the bit of the recording that we managed to make work into the chat there, and I just wanted to say that we're going to do another session addressing business issues, so highlighting the impact of these changes on businesses. And I'd be really grateful for suggestions in the chat or directly to me for resources that we can highlight, or anyone who might be willing to talk to the topic, because I suspect that's going to be one source of real pushback. We've already started to see it happening. And then the other thing is just, again, I've dropped it into the chat. There's a little podcast about some of these developments that our public sector team, that's me as a charity lawyer now, talking to the public sector team about trying to highlight the issues, and again, highlight the need to get engagement right in order to try and reduce pushback. And in a similar way, if there are ideas about resources or topics that I might help push out to local authorities that way, I'd really welcome knowing about them. Okay,
thanks for that. Yeah, really good point, and quite a good segue. And while we're advertising things, Simon did do a really good article I read today in the local transport today, and I'm trying to get him to come in and talk with us about some of the work we've been doing on engagement as well. But yeah, we've waited long enough. There's a man with some serious answers here who's been really making some inroads in quite a difficult area of the country to make inroads. So, Grahame, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I think
floor is yours.
Now, okay, that seems to have worked. Just let me clear some rubbish from my screen. Okay, yeah, it's been a bit of a build up here, and I don't claim to be an expert on all this. Really, I think the area where we've had some success is in community generated B network schemes. But one of the things that I've certainly been concerned about for a long time, and other people in our active travel forum, which is where I first presented on this topic, is that engagement is an area where we're actually quite behind. We don't feel engagement is as well developed as it ought to be. And it's really hard. I mean, getting people's attention is extremely hard. It seems to me the best way to get people's attention is just to do something, and then you'll get their attention, as has been found out in virtually every project, actually. Now, I think this particular quote from one of my heroes, Machiavelli gets a bad press, really, but he was a genius. He really knew what he was talking about in terms of politics. And what he said was in the Prince, it must be considered that there is nothing more difficult to carry out, nor more doubtful of success, nor more dangerous to handle than to initiate a new order of things, which is what we're talking about here. For the reformer has enemies in all those who would profit by the old order, and only lukewarm defenders in all those who would profit by the new order. And then this is the important bit for us. This lukewarmness arising partly from the incredulity of mankind, who does not truly believe in anything new until they actually have experience of it. And actually that tells us everything we need to know. But I'll carry on anyway. I won't stop at that point. So just coming to Levenshulme, the reason that I started looking at this, particularly on behalf of our Active Travel Forum, was because of what was happening in Levenshulme. And I knew all about what's been called Backlash, but I try and avoid that term in our context because we're talking about active travel and possibly not even just active travel, but much bigger things than that. It's not just about bikes, and we'll come back to that a bit later. But in Levenshulme, what they found was all of a sudden, without really expecting it, they got very highly organized opposition with all sorts of misinformation being bandied about on social media, people saying they haven't been consulted, and this was after a year of consultation, lots of emotive language used in all of this backlash, and a massive social media campaign. If you look at that Facebook group, if it's still there, I don't know how long it will remain, you'll see there are thousands and thousands of messages in opposition to the scheme. The City Council apparently distancing itself from the project, which, I mean, today we've seen that that's gone a lot further, although there's a question mark now over whether that means they've distanced themselves from the project or distanced themselves from the community group who have been driving the project forward. I think the project will carry on, actually, but time will tell what it'll actually look like in the end. The trials were postponed for an unspecified period for further consultation, and that's very disappointing. We'll come back to why that's particularly disappointing. The sorts of things that they saw, well, the Manchester Evening News did an article on it on the 28th of June. I'll not read through that. If people want to look at it later, that's fine. So a few of the comments here from the Facebook group, these I almost chose at random because you just dip in and you'll find things that are quite extreme. Here's one example. Now, somebody said that. Now, I have no idea whether that's true or not. But the problem you have is it's very difficult to know what's true and what isn't. And so you come against what's called Brandolini's law in the internet context, which says basically the amount of energy needed to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than to produce it. And if you come across that problem, then you just get overwhelmed if you're not prepared for it. And I think the project volunteers in Levenshulme have really felt overwhelmed by that. Actually, Brandolini's law is a relatively new thing. Mark Twain put it a different way a long time ago when he said, a lie can go halfway around the world before the truth has got its boots on. And it's the same issue. So why is that particular project had so much backlash? Well, actually, all projects that are meaningful will have backlash. And David RDT, who was here last week, I don't know if he's here this week, said some time ago, if there's no backlash, then whatever it is you're doing is unlikely to make any significant difference. And actually, the fact that you've got backlash means you're actually making a difference. So if we look at some other examples, if we look at the London Borough Mini Hollands, well, Brian, among others, must be very familiar with these. The London boroughs of Enfield, Waltham Forest and Kingston. In Enfield, this was the sort of thing that appeared in shops all around the centre. Lots of these, and in fact one shop was the window was completely plastered in these things. There was a petition in Waltham Forest after the changes, the first tranche of changes had been made to try and get them reversed. And in that petition, in 2016, one of the things they said was the so-called consultations were very flawed. despite the fact that a year before there'd actually been a review, and the judge who was in charge of that review said that there was no merit whatsoever in any of the criticisms. And it's always pleasing to see that the group was actually ordered to pay a contribution towards the cost of £12,000 in total. So that's sort of a good aspect. Another example from Waltham Forest, social media thing, these road closures cause traffic to be squeezed onto other roads. Well, that might be true, and you have to be careful that is managed properly. But the claim that's on there was no evidence to support the fact that those claims are correct. And the problem you have is, how do you prove that something didn't happen? It's not possible to prove something didn't happen, or it's very difficult. And some of them get absolutely ridiculous. In Kingston, one of the claims by the anti-people was that terrorists could actually poison the water supply because of this Mini Holland scheme. The reason was that there were actually some water pipes running in a location close to one of the changes, which it's just incredible. I mean, you don't know whether to laugh or cry sometimes. But the good news is that a lot of this is actually just a vocal minority. And if you look at a comment by the people at Enfield, despite all their sound and fury, the noisy minority really were a minority after all. And then there's a fantastic book which anybody who's interested in this stuff should read, probably a lot of people here have, by Jeanette Sadiq Khan, about the changes that they brought about in New York City. And the same thing. Judged by the polls, what had sounded like a chorus of opposition in the media was actually a small but determined section of the population. And one of the problems is that section of the population can be very well organised. So Sally Hinchcliffe wrote an article back in 2016 about the Mini Hollands and the Backlash, and she actually did a list of some of the lessons that have been learnt from that, and how you could sort of change the dialogue somewhat. So the first thing is you've got to counter the misinformation. Now that means you've got to have things ready in advance. You can't wait until the onslaught comes before you have your answers ready. Reframe the debate, and this is really important for us. It's not about bicycles. It's about everything else but bicycles, actually. It's about cleaner air. It's about having nice places to shop, places to exercise, better health outcomes, and all the sorts of things that really do come out of these schemes. It's also about children. I mean, children actually are suffering a lot from, for example, poor air quality, not being able to play out on the streets anymore, as we did in my day. And then the last one that she said is let the council feel the love. And we'll come back to some of those as we go through this. So the first thing I want to say is engagement versus consultation. Consultation is what tends to be done, or the way that people perceive consultation is what tends to be done. And it comes across as, here is the proposal, we've worked out all the details, have you got any comments before we get on with it? And that's the way it often comes across to people who are being consulted. And what we really need is to shift so that the engagement is more a case of saying, look, do you agree that this problem exists? And that's the first step. Once you've agreed that those problems exist, then it's about trying to discuss and also try out possible solutions. And that tryout is really quite important. If you look at an example again from Enfield Mini Holland, one of the things that that people, you need to be very careful that people understand what the consultation is about. It's about helping the council to get it right. It's not about voting on whether the thing should go ahead at all. And the Enfield Mini Holland quotes here, we were at pains to point out that the process is a consultation, not a referendum. And so you have to be careful what questions you ask in the consultation or engagement, that to make sure you don't make it look like it's a vote on whether the thing should go ahead at all. Similarly, in Seville, in Spain, fantastic changes in a very short period. In about 4 years, they put a whole network across Seville. And the designer of the network, the person in charge of the project, said the trick is to set the expectation that the public input will determine how to add the bike lanes to a street, not whether to add them. Now, the emphasis was still on bike lanes, and I think we should be careful with that, as we'll come back to in a moment. So next thing, clarity of message. It's very important, I think, to make sure that the message about what you're trying to achieve is very clear, and that everybody who's involved, the council, campaigners, everybody that's involved in trying to make this thing happen, is actually saying the same things, so that that message is very clear. For the Emergency Active Travel Fund projects, this is really what the message should be. And it's about creating space for social distancing, enabling businesses to open, saving public transport. Those are the objectives, and we need to make that very clear. The solutions to those, the ways of achieving those objectives will involve changes to the streets for traffic and cycleways and so on. But that's what it's really about. So the first thing we need to do when we're trying to do all of this is to establish some common ground. Don't talk about solutions. Don't present your finished solution and say, what do you think? First, you have to agree that the nature of the problem is what it is. So the problem that we have in general that we're trying to solve here is dysfunctional, unpleasant urban environment, often caused by motor traffic, noise, congestion, pollution. Actually use examples, fairly emotive examples, just as the anti-people do. For example, in the Netherlands, they had the Stop the Kindermoord campaign, which was Stop the Child Murder campaign, which helped to kick off the changes that happened in the Netherlands. And those sorts of things, it's really quite difficult for people to disagree with. And if you establish those, then you're starting on the right track. It's also important, I think, to gather evidence. And there are lots of places to get evidence to back up your own claims and to refute other people's claims. I've said at the bottom of this that it's actually a necessary thing to have this evidence, but it's not sufficient. And I'll come back to that right at the end, actually, because there's a video that I want to recommend that really shows you how this stuff all works. So things like consultations, the commonplace consultations we've got going in many places, including districts of Greater Manchester. National data sets are incredibly valuable. There's so much rich information available just to download from the government. Local and international research, and then for local data, in addition to consultations, actual facts, audits and photographs. This is actually a picture of what part of my commute used to look like when I used to cycle all home from Salford to Astley Bridge in Bolton every day. And I used to do this every day, going up between those lines of traffic. That is evidence that there is a problem. And I noted that people took 20 minutes to get up that road, and I could get up there, even with that traffic, in about 10 on my bike. So looking at some other examples here, I was lucky enough to go to New York City a few times, and the first time was in the year 2000, and I actually took some pictures with my new digital camera that I got. It was actually a Kodak digital camera, so it's ironic that that thing in the middle is there on the left-hand picture. That's what it looked like in 2000, and then on the right is what it looked like when I went there with my wife for a holiday in 2017. On the first picture, there's 5 lines of traffic all going the same way on Broadway and 7th Avenue. In the right-hand one, we're just looking at Broadway, and there's no traffic whatsoever on Broadway there because it's pedestrianised and there's a cycleway through. One of the problems that they had after they'd done that, coming back to the evidence, is taxi drivers complained that the change was causing delays, traffic jams and fewer fares. And it was repeated and repeated in the news outlets, and some of them were quite angry about it. But it happened that all of the taxis had been installed with GPS some time earlier before this happened. And looking at the data from those GPS systems, about 1.1 million sets of data points, that showed the traffic was moving faster, not slower. So again, people, they're not lying people, but they just believe that these changes have happened because they can't remember what it's like before. Okay, so I mentioned reframing the debate, and I said I'd come back to this issue of whether it's about bicycles, and really a lot of this is about asking the right questions, asking the questions in the right way. If you start by saying, how can we provide for cycles? The next question is, well, yeah, how can we do that, but without affecting the flow of motor traffic? And that leads to poorer quality interventions, and actually you really don't get very far if you follow that tack. If you start by saying, how can we make our spaces nice for people, nothing to do with walking or cycling, actually, it's just about making the place a bit nicer, that leads to the question, well, perhaps it's about reducing motor traffic. But then people will say, well, how will people get around in that case? And so the answer, of course, is on cycles. And we have data that shows from TFGM's diary survey that 65% of car and van journeys in Bolton are less than 5 kilometres. So that's, you know, that means there are a lot of journeys that are being undertaken in Bolton that actually don't need to be done in cars or vans. And in fact, 80% of journeys are less than 10 kilometres, which actually for a lot of people is perfectly cyclable. So if you reframe it in this way, cycles become part of the solution, not part of the problem. And similarly with walking. Now, I think it's important in doing this to think carefully about the objectives that you're coming up with. And coming away from the COVID-19 thing for the moment to the more general sort of street improvements, what we're talking about is reduction of motor traffic, not as a side effect of what we're trying to do, but as the reason for what we're trying to do. And we don't talk about blocking off streets, we talk about removing rat runs. Quieter residential streets, places for people to enjoy, for children, bringing back the children, shopping streets, places to sit down, rest, chat, more greenery, just a much more pleasant urban environment. And I found a fantastic resource, which some people here may know about, but I hadn't come across it till recently, from the London Assembly. And there's a link there to that, and that'll be on the, available on the slideshow afterwards. And it's really worth looking at. It's a huge document with about 80 odd pages, but you pick out the things you need, and it's really good. So the next stage then is, once you've got some idea of the kinds of solutions that, that people are coming up with and you discussed it, you need to have trials. You need to try these things out. Coming back to Machiavelli's third point there, it's this incredulity. People don't actually believe that anything is possible until they actually feel it. It doesn't matter what data you throw at them. It doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter how many other places around the world you quote. Unless they've experienced it themselves, they won't actually understand it. And coming back to Jeanette Sadiq Khan, this quote from her book I found quite revealing. And one of the things that they really tried to do was to do things as quickly as possible so that they could be tried out. So making pedestrian plazas using paint and bollards initially, rather than paving, just to try things out. And that way you can actually say to people, well, it doesn't matter, we'll change it back if it doesn't work. And if you're doing that, then you have to be able to listen to the responses. You need to be flexible. You need to agree that you'll change anything that doesn't work, but only on the basis of evidence, not on just loud opinions. And that what you want people to do is help us to get it right. And the trial is, it should be very clear that the trial is part of the consultation. That's one of the reasons I was so disappointed to see the trial postponed in the Levenshulme case, because it's only by doing that trial, by trying things out, that you'll actually get people really engaged and discussing what's happening. We also need to be careful about our use of language when we're doing that communication. We need to avoid using jargon, but sometimes, and jargon is actually the language of the domain that you're working in. So sometimes it's actually much easier to use the correct word rather than a whole paragraph that actually defines what that word is. But where you have to use jargon, provide some information about what that jargon means. And one of the things that Levenshulme has done well, although I think it came quite late, was defining all of the terms that are being used. And the other aspect of the use of language is not just not using language that people won't understand because they're not familiar with those terms, but actually saying things in the right way. Don't say we want to block off this street by installing barriers. Say we want to open up this street for people by getting rid of rat running. One of the things I've noticed on a few of the things I've seen, a few of the active neighbourhood and model filtering schemes I've seen, is a big sign at the entrance to this walking and cycling street that says road closed. That's disastrous. We don't want to have road closed. It's not been closed. It's actually been opened up so that people can use it. And that emphasizes the positives rather than bringing people's attention to what some people would consider the cost of doing this. Being prepared, I said, we need to have our information available in advance. What Waltham Forest have done is fantastic. They have a huge frequently asked questions, which answers most of the questions that anyone would need to ask. Okay, now coming back to something that has become even more relevant, this is today because of the announcements regarding the Levenshulme scheme. I think it's really critical for us to try and keep councils on board as we go along through all these things. Notice from the Mini Hollands again, Enfield. We're lucky to have a councillor in charge of Enfield's Mini Holland scheme who calls the opposition a badge of honour, pointing out that, as we said before, if you're not getting backlash, you're not really doing very much. And so that's really good. And make it very clear that the project is a council project, and we are acting as cheerleaders, and we're doing a lot of work to help the council, but it's the council's project. And that's something that sort of, I think, took everybody by surprise around the Levenshulme project, that it suddenly became a project that was being pushed forward by a bunch of enthusiasts, and the council didn't seem to know anything about it in the first instance. There was really a sort of standoffish kind of approach. So we have to try and make sure that that doesn't happen on our projects. The council message should be clear if we can achieve that. So I just looked at random for a few of these, and Warrington said, council pledges to transform active travel. That's on the Warrington website. And this is particularly in relation to COVID-19, but it's really passing on the same message that the government's passing on in relation to initially dealing with the COVID-19 problem and how to deal with problems as people go back to work and shops open and so on. But it's also talking about long-term benefits, and the government's very clear on that. So how do we try and deal with that? Well, I think it's worth doing initially. What's worth doing is trying to understand the dynamics of all this. And now this is something that I just put together quite hurriedly today, but it's to try and get a picture of what it looks like from the council's point of view. The council formally the council is the group of elected members that are elected by all the people in the wards. They have a highways department who are experts, who actually know what they're talking about when it comes to highways. And then there's this whole load of people at the bottom there, which I've called the silent majority. And in that majority, there are a few people we could call campaigners. There are a few people we could call the loud opposition. The campaigners actually often have a path to talk to the council if they're lucky. We sort of achieved that in Bolton to some extent, but it's not easy. But the loud opposition actually can be amplified by the press. And that's why this kind of opposition makes councils very nervous, because the press are very powerful. Now, one of the things that's changed recently, and I was disappointed to see one of the things that Bob mentioned, was that as of the 9th of May, there is actually central government commitment to this. And that not only includes statutory guidance, which I hope will come in. I didn't realise it hadn't actually come in yet. But it also includes funding, a vision, strategic priorities, someone to look after that, and design guidance to help highways departments who are not used to providing for walking and cycling in preference to motor vehicles to do that. And so there is some hope. And if we look at that statutory guidance, assuming that actually does become a reality, then this is actually placing a statutory duty on councils to make changes that will reallocate road space from motor vehicles to people walking and cycling. Now, that sounds like a stick to beat councils with, but actually, if we turn it round, it's something that the councils can actually use, because it means they're not only listening to a bunch of loonies who want to have everybody riding bikes everywhere, they're actually implementing government policy if they actually do these things. The other thing that's worth looking at is the council policy itself. So Bolton's core strategy says this: will ensure that developments take the following into account: accessibility by different types of transport, prioritising pedestrians, cyclists, public transport users over other motorised vehicle users. Now that's in the council policy, and it's been in there for years. And so getting into those council policies and seeing that. Now, again, that is not a stick to beat the council with. That is something the council can use to say, well, look, this has been agreed years ago that we would do this kind of thing. And so actually there's never been a better time for councils to go back to those policies and say, look, we're trying to do something about this now. And then finally, there was the one about let the council feel the love. I mean, councils must feel quite beleaguered when they get all of this negative publicity. So it's worth actually pointing out that there are good things happening. And here in Bolton, there are some fantastic things happening. The picture on the left there shows our first Cyclops junction, which is currently being built. The one on the right shows the one that's expected to follow on with the project starting in November after the left-hand one is finished. And so actually shouting about these and things and saying how wonderful they are and showing the council that there's a lot of support for these kinds of things, it is important. And one of the things I realized very recently in relation to the Cyclops junction is that the genius of the Cyclops design is not particularly a technical one, it's actually a political one. It means the fact that you can get as much traffic or possibly even more traffic through these than you did before under the right circumstances, and that's important, means that it's much easier to get these things in. And so actually shouting about them when they do go in, I think is really important for us to do. Okay, that's me finished, but I just wanted to say one more thing. There was a video that I saw a long time ago and I'd completely forgotten about, which is about what's they've called Backlash, because it was particularly about cycling more than anything else in New York City. And these two do a 45-minute act, which is absolutely brilliant. It's very entertaining, but it tells you, because they've actually been through all this, these are activists that worked within the changes that Jeanette Sadiq-Khan was trying to get through and succeeded. And so they've got the experience, which is, I certainly haven't got experience of making these things work. And so it's well worth spending 45 minutes watching this video, and you'll enjoy it. And you'll actually learn an awful lot by doing that.
Okay, so this is an idea that's been knocking around in my mind for quite a long time, and we're doing some work with Bob McDonald for Birmingham City Council on pop-up stuff, and this was an idea that we had. We're not sure if it's going to see the light of day on the current round of schemes, but it was an idea where space is limited. We're not talking about very heavily trafficked streets, but what can we do where space is limited? We need to get in some cycle facilities, and we don't have a lot of cash to spend. What can we do? And this is something I thought we might try to have a go at. So cycle streets, we're all, again, or many of us are familiar with those. You know, effectively a street that looks like it is primarily designed for cycling. This is some quotes from the Welsh Active Travel Guidance, which I think is a pretty comprehensive national document. This is the current draft that's out for consultation at the moment. So primary cycle route should be low volumes of traffic and high volumes of traffic that significantly exceed motor traffic levels. Not sure if we can get that in many places, but a legible design and maintains priority for cyclists. This is the detail of what they might look like. So this is the little design template that's in the back of this document. So if you're not familiar with the Welsh Active Travel design guide, I suggest have a look at it. There's quite a lot of detailed stuff in there. Welsh local authorities are meant to apply it. I'm not sure they do all that often, but they're meant to. But it is actually, until we get LTN 120, which hopefully isn't too long now, this is a document that the Department for Transport has actually endorsed for use in England. Anyway, moving on. Obviously, where they're done, they can look quite good. This is the Taff Embankment in the Greener Grangetown scheme in Cardiff. This scheme was actually designed really as a water quality scheme. It's all about reducing the rate of runoff, and it's got rain gardens. It's a really, really nice scheme. But in terms of cycling, it's great. It's got quite high cycle volumes, low traffic volumes, low motor traffic volumes, and the speeds are held down by just the nature of it. It looks like it's different. The little rumbly surface in the middle means you've always got one wheel on it, if you're in a car, and it just slows things down. But of course, that's expensive to do in these straightened times. So how can we get close to that? Well, I think this is obviously the poor man's version. This is the advisory cycle lanes with centerline removal. So where we haven't got space to fit in cycle lanes and we've got a two-way road, what's been done a lot is that we would narrow the centre, take out the centre line, narrow the space in the centre so it might only be 4 meters wide, 5 meters wide maybe. So two vehicles, certainly two large vehicles, have difficulty in passing, and therefore they have to move into advisory cycle lanes when they meet head on. Now that's clearly not desirable for high traffic volumes. The Welsh Active Travel Guide says around 4,500 vehicles a day, but this might be a type of measure that takes us from the sort of desirable 2,000 vehicles a day limit for completely sharing with motor traffic to something that takes us, you know, to that little higher level. Now, the Dutch have been doing it for quite a long time, and so have the French. So the French call it the choquet doux, which I really like. That is the chaussée pour la circulation douce, for soft traffic. If my computer sound works, there's a really nice cheesy French little soundtrack to this. Yeah, wasn't that nice? Lovely. Share the space, that means. But where it's been doing this country, it's not been terrifically successful, I have to say. This is the Avenues in Norwich. Some of you may know it. This is probably the busiest cycle route in the city. In the distance there, beyond where this street view image is taken, is the University of East Anglia. So it's quite high levels of cycling. I was involved in this scheme in the early days, and originally it was intended to provide some step cycle tracks, but then it was found with these mature trees, it is the Avenues, there were some real difficulties in getting those step cycle tracks in. So this was done, and I think the local campaign group felt very shortchanged. And you can probably just about hopefully make out in the distance, there's a car coming towards the camera, and the driver is completely ignoring the cycle lane marking. That is the problem with this. There's nothing to require the driver to stay in that central position, which I think is something that we could fix very easily. So this is what we've got: advisory cycle lanes with centre line removal, and this is the common problem. I think, you know, with a judicious application of some ones, and we don't need too many of these. I think, you know, if you're driving along there and you've got ones maybe every 40 meters, you're simply not going to drive in the cycle lane. You're going to stay in that central position. We don't need a huge amount of kit just to reinforce the fact that we should, you know, the driver should stay out of those advisory cycle lanes. But I think we can go a little bit further. I think, you know, we could extend the narrowing or the enforcement of the central lane. We could put maybe 6 of those ones locally. We could maybe have, I don't know, 10, 12 meters of protected route there, and maybe we could just bolt down a speed cushion as well. You know, that's a pretty cheap thing to do, and we slowed the traffic down at that time as well. And the ones mean that the drivers have no choice but to drive over it. And I think we could call that a protected cycle street by having, you know, these maybe every 30, 40 meters. Yes, of course, when two vehicles meet, they do have to move into the advisory lanes, but they can't do that for very long because they've got to go through the next narrowing. And there's some guidance. I mean, in the Welsh Active Travel Guide, it says I think about 4,500. In the Crow manual, there's actually a chart that talks about, as the volumes of traffic goes up, how frequently vehicles will have to go into the cycle lanes. It depends on the tidality. If you've got a route that is heavily inbound to the city centre in the morning, so there's little oncoming traffic, and reverse in the evening, then the conflicts between vehicles in both directions is not going to be so great. So it might work for slightly higher volumes in that situation. So here's what I think, you know, it might look like on the Avenues. And I think, as far as I'm aware, no one's done this yet. It's something that we've suggested for some routes. We'd like to see it tried, but I thought it was worth putting up, see if anyone else agrees that it might be worth trialing for these difficult situations where you're constrained on width. Obviously, it's more suitable for places with off-street parking. If you've got on-street parking, that's not going to work. You're going to need parking controls. But here in the Avenues, all these properties have got off-street parking. So I think this could work pretty well in many of our sort of 1930s, 1950s suburbs, just maybe the next ring of development out beyond the low traffic neighbourhoods. So that was it for me. Thank you very much.